Picture a man who once made Europe tremble, a conqueror whose name alone could silence kings, now reduced to a shivering wreck on a remote speck of earth. It's March 17th, 1821, on St. Helena, a jagged volcanic island lost in the South Atlantic, 2,000 miles from the nearest mainland. The wind howls across its barren cliffs, carrying the briny scent of the sea and the weight of isolation. Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor who redrew the map of Europe, can no longer stand without help. His hands, which once gripped cannon wheels mid-battle, tremble as he clutches a copper bathtub's edges, the only refuge from the fire raging in his gut. 6 years earlier, this same man escaped exile on Elba, marched across France with a mere 1,000 men, and reclaimed his throne without firing a shot. Soldiers sent to arrest him threw down their weapons and cheered. Now he can't hold down a sip of water. The transformation is staggering, a fall from godlike power to a frailty that shocks even his loyal servants. History teaches a sanitized version of Napoleon's end, exiled, defeated, forgotten. But the truth is far uglier, buried in physicians' notes and witness testimonies too grim for schoolbooks. In his final weeks, the man who ruled from Madrid to Moscow begged for sugar water like a child, his body dissolving from within, his mind unraveling in pain. What you're about to hear is the story of a military genius reduced to something barely human, a tale so disturbing it was hushed by those who saw it. The Napoleon who survived over 60 battles, who walked through grapeshot unscathed and endured the Russian winter's bite, would die one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. And worse, the doctors meant to save him hastened his end with treatments so brutal they'd be called torture today. St. Helena was a prison of rock and sea, its damp air thick with the smell of salt and decay. Longwood House, Napoleon's final home, was a crumbling estate, its walls stained with mold, its rooms stifling despite the island's chill. The emperor, once accustomed to the gilded halls of the Tuileries, now lived in a place where rats skittered across the floorboards and the wind rattled loose shutters. His valet, Louis-Joseph Marchand, watched in quiet horror as the man who worked 18-hour days now spent entire afternoons submerged in a copper tub. The water, scalding hot, turned his skin lobster red, peeling in strips as he soaked for 6, sometimes 8 hours, adding more boiling water when it cooled. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the tub's edges, the only place where the searing pain in his stomach dulled to a bearable throb. Every movement outside the tub felt like a hot knife twisting in his gut. Food, once devoured in 15-minute meals, fuel for a mind that never rested, now triggered violent retching. The smell of bread, once a comfort in army camps, made him gag. His servants, used to his iron discipline, exchanged worried glances as the man who once dined with kings refused even broth. What was happening inside his body was a silent war, more ruthless than any battlefield. A tumor, a carcinoma the size of a fist, had taken root in his stomach lining, wrapping around the organ like a parasite. Every heartbeat fed it, every breath pressed it against his other organs, a mass of corrupted tissue eating him alive, cell by cell. The pain was relentless, a fire that no amount of hot water could extinguish. This was no ordinary illness, but a betrayal of the body that had carried him through triumphs. The island's isolation amplified his suffering. St. Helena, as described in contemporary accounts like those of Captain Mundy, was a desolate rock, cut off from the world, its supply ships arriving only sporadically. Napoleon's world had shrunk from empires to a single room where the cloying dampness clung to everything, and the distant crash of waves was a constant reminder of his exile. The cultural context of exile in the early 19th century was brutal. European powers, as seen in cases like the banishment of Louis XVIII to England, used remote islands to erase threats, stripping them of dignity as much as power. For Napoleon, this was a fall not just from glory, but from humanity itself. His servants, like Marchand, who had followed him from the grandeur of Fontainebleau, now saw a man whose eyes, once sharp with strategy, dulled with pain. The emotional weight of this descent was crushing. Imagine the man who crowned himself emperor, who stared down czars and sultans, now clinging to a bathtub, his voice weak, his body failing. The contrast was a tragedy that gripped those around him, their loyalty tested by the sight of their leader's decay. The stage was set for a horror that would unfold over weeks, each day peeling away more of the man who had been Napoleon, leaving only a shell, consumed by disease and desperation. By April 1821, the windswept desolation of St. Helena had become a prison not just for Napoleon Bonaparte's body, but for his very essence. Longwood House, with its peeling walls and mold-streaked ceilings, was a tomb for the living, its air heavy with damp and the faint, sickly sweet odor of decay. The emperor, once a titan who reshaped Europe, was now a shadow, his body betraying him in ways that horrified those who served him. The tumor in his stomach, a carcinoma over 4 inches long, had grown like a malevolent force, wrapping around his stomach lining and pressing against his organs with every breath. This was no silent killer. It was a ravenous beast, consuming him cell by cell, its presence felt in every wrenching pang that drove him back to his scalding copper bathtub. His valet, Louis-Joseph Marchand, recorded in his memoirs the ghastly transformation. The emperor's frame, once robust, now seemed to waste before our eyes. Napoleon's arms, which had once seized cannon wheels mid-battle to reposition them with a general's precision, had withered to skin-covered bones. So frail you could encircle his bicep with thumb and finger and still have room to spare. Yet his belly, grotesquely swollen with fluid from the cancer, jutted out like that of a woman 9 months pregnant, forcing him to lean backward when he tried to walk. A skeletal figure balancing an obscene burden. The contrast was so stark it shocked even Count Montholon, a loyalist since Waterloo, who wrote, "His form was no longer that of a man, but a mockery of life itself." The smell in his room was beyond mere sickness. It was the cloying, sweet stench of tissue death, as parts of the tumor necrotized while Napoleon still breathed. His servants burned sulfur and incense in a futile attempt to mask it, sealing the windows on doctors' orders. Leaving fresh air would worsen his condition. The result was an atmosphere so thick it clung to the throat, a miasma of rot and despair. Contemporary accounts, like those of Barry O'Mara, Napoleon's former physician, describe the room as a charnel house, where life and death mingled in unholy union. The tumor's growth was relentless, its effects visible in every aspect of Napoleon's decline. His skin, once bronze from campaigns in Egypt and Italy, had turned a sickly yellow from liver failure, his fingernails blue from oxygen starvation. Every meal was a torment, even the simplest broth triggered violent retching, as the tumor blocked his stomach's ability to process food. The pain was constant, a fire that flared with every movement, forcing him to spend hours in his tub, where the scalding water offered fleeting relief. This physical decay was not unique to Napoleon. Other exiled leaders, like the Roman general Coriolanus, banished to die among the Volsci, Or the Russian revolutionary Trotsky, wasting away in Mexico, faced similar bodily betrayals, their once mighty forms eroded by isolation and disease. But Napoleon's case was singular in its horror. The speed and brutality of his decline a stark contrast to his meteoric life. The medical knowledge of the time, as detailed in 19th-century texts, like Thomas Watson's Principles and Practice of Physic, offered little insight into gastric cancer, attributing such symptoms to morbid humors or visceral obstruction. Doctors could only guess at the cause, their treatments as likely to harm as to heal. Napoleon's servants, bound by loyalty, watched helplessly as their emperor's body became a battleground. The cultural context of the era amplified the tragedy. Exile was meant to strip a man of power, but for Napoleon, it stripped his humanity. The British, who guarded St. Helena, ensured his isolation was absolute, their surveillance a constant reminder of his fall. Letters from Governor Hudson Lowe reveal a cold indifference to Napoleon's suffering, noting only that the prisoner's health declines, as expected. Yet within Longwood House, the emotional toll was palpable. Marchand, who had seen Napoleon command armies, now saw him struggle to lift a spoon, his hands shaking as he tried to sip sugar water, a childlike plea that broke the hearts of those around him. The tumor's growth was not just a physical assault, but a psychological one, robbing Napoleon of the control that had defined him. His servants, accustomed to his iron will, now faced a man whose body defied his commands. The room, with its shuttered windows and flickering candles, became a microcosm of his exile, a place where glory was a distant memory, replaced by the relentless advance of disease. The horror was not just in the symptoms, but in the transformation, from a man who had bent empires to his will to one who could not bend his own body to obey. As April wore on, the tumor tightened its grip, each day bringing new indignities, each symptom a reminder that the emperor who had conquered nations was now at the mercy of a foe he could not outmaneuver. The dim, suffocating air of Longwood House on St. Helena in April 1821 was a far cry from the battlefields where Napoleon Bonaparte once orchestrated triumphs that reshaped Europe. By now, the emperor's mind, that tactical genius, which had outmaneuvered armies at Austerlitz and Jena, was unraveling under the relentless assault of pain and disease. The tumor in his stomach, a carcinoma devouring him from within, had turned his body into a grotesque shell, but it was his mind's descent that struck his loyal servants with a deeper horror. Louis Joseph Marchand, his valet, recorded in his memoirs the heart-wrenching sight. The emperor, once master of his thoughts, now spoke to shadows of the past. Napoleon's hallucinations were vivid, explosive, dragging him back to the glory days of his campaigns. One moment, he would bolt upright in bed, his skeletal arms flailing as he shouted orders to invisible troops. "The cavalry! Send in the guard now!" he cried, his voice hoarse but commanding, as if he were again at the Battle of Austerlitz, directing a flanking maneuver against Austrians long dead. His hands traced maps that existed only in his mind, positioning battalions with the precision of a general who never lost his edge. Then, in quieter moments, he called for Josephine, his first wife, dead for 7 years, her name a whisper of longing from a man drowning in his own body's betrayal. "Josephine, where is the water?" he murmured, as if back in the Egyptian desert, reliving campaigns from 2 decades past. Marchand wept openly, unable to reconcile the emperor's brilliance with the delirium consuming him. The contrast was shattering. A mind that had redrawn Europe's borders, now trapped in a fractured past, fighting battles that no longer existed. Even in this state, Napoleon's ego burned bright. On April 15th, Palm Sunday, he summoned Abbé Vignali, the priest, for last rites, declaring matter-of-factly, I know I'm dying. Yet, true to form, he refused to surrender control. Between bouts of delirium, he dictated his will with military precision. Every clause calculated for impact. He bequeathed 10,000 francs to Canton, the man who attempted to assassinate Wellington, a final shot at his enemies from a deathbed 2,000 miles from Europe. The Memorial de Sainte-Helene, penned by his companion Las Cases, notes this act as a testament to his unyielding spirit, even as his body failed. This blend of lucidity and madness was not unique to Napoleon. Other fallen leaders, like the exiled Byzantine Emperor Justinian II, whose mutilated face drove him to fits of rage, or Charles VI of France, who believed he was made of glass, succumbed to mental collapses under the weight of defeat and isolation. But Napoleon's hallucinations were a theater of his own making, a stage where he replayed his greatest victories while his body rotted. The psychological toll, as modern trauma studies suggest, likely stemmed from the unbearable tension between his indomitable will and his physical powerlessness. The man who had never flinched under fire was now a prisoner of his own flesh, his mind retreating to a time when he was invincible. The cultural context of 19th-century Europe added another layer of tragedy. Mental decline was stigmatized, seen as a weakness unfit for a leader. Napoleon's servants, bound by loyalty, struggled to maintain his dignity, draping blankets over his emaciated frame, whispering reassurances as he raved about battles long won. The room at Longwood, with its sealed windows and sulfur-laden air, became a crucible for this mental unraveling. The flickering candlelight cast shadows that seemed to dance with his visions, the damp walls closing in like the enemies he once outwitted. His calls for Josephine were particularly poignant. Their marriage, though dissolved, had been a cornerstone of his rise, and her absence now haunted him. The letters of Napoleon preserve his devotion to her, even in exile, and his cries for her in delirium suggest a longing for the one person who saw him not as an emperor, but as a man. This vulnerability, so at odds with his public persona, gripped his entourage, who saw in these moments the human beneath the myth. Yet even as his mind fractured, Napoleon's will to command persisted. He tried to rise from bed, demanding to review his army, only to collapse, his swollen belly and withered limbs betraying him. His servants, like Ali, the Mamluk who had served him since Egypt, held him down, their loyalty tested by the sight of their emperor reduced to a childlike state. Begging for relief. The emotional weight of these scenes was crushing, a reminder that even the greatest minds could not outrun mortality. The island's isolation, described by Governor Hudson Lowe as a necessary confinement, amplified the sense of abandonment. Napoleon's mental battles, fought in the confines of his decaying body, were a microcosm of his exile, a war he could not win. As April bled into May, the line between past and present blurred further. Each hallucination, a desperate grasp at a glory that was slipping away, leaving only pain and the specter of death. The air in Longwood House, heavy with the stench of sulfur and decay, was a suffocating shroud over Napoleon Bonaparte's final days in April 1821. St. Helena's isolation, its winds howling across barren cliffs, seemed to mock the emperor who once commanded empires. Now his body was a battlefield, ravaged by a tumor that turned his stomach into a festering ruin. But it was the treatments inflicted by his doctors, led by the British physician Dr. Archibald Arnott, that transformed his suffering into a nightmare of medieval cruelty. These were not acts of healing, but of desperation, rooted in the misguided medical practices of the early 19th century, and they accelerated Napoleon's descent into agony. His valet, Louis-Joseph Marchand, recorded the horror in his memoirs. The emperor endured torments no soldier on the battlefield could imagine. When Napoleon's intestines, blocked by the tumor, refused to function, Arnault prescribed calomel, 10 grains of mercury chloride, a poison by any modern standard. The first dose triggered a grotesque reaction. Napoleon expelled a massive tar-black stool, reeking of blood and decay, a sign of severe internal bleeding. Arnault, steeped in the era's belief that purging was progress, saw this as a victory and ordered another 10 grains. The mercury seared through Napoleon's already ravaged system, each dose corroding what little vitality remained. The Lancet of the 1820s, a leading medical journal, endorsed such treatments, claiming mercury cleansed the humors. But today we know it likely poisoned his organs further, hastening the tumor's destruction. The doctors didn't stop there. They applied blistering plasters, soaked in crushed cantharides beetles, a caustic agent that caused chemical burns, to Napoleon's chest, feet, and calves. The theory, rooted in humoral medicine, was that external pain would draw out the internal disease. His skin, already yellowed by jaundice, erupted in angry red welts that oozed clear fluid, adding new torment to his cancer-ridden body. Barry O'Meara, a former physician, later wrote that the plasters burned so fiercely that the emperor's cries could be heard beyond his chamber. These treatments were not unique to Napoleon. Similar practices were inflicted on figures like King George III, whose madness was treated with blistering and purges, as documented in royal medical records. But for Napoleon, they were a special kind of humiliation. The man who had walked unscathed through grapeshot at Toulon was now screaming under the touch of beetle-soaked cloth, his dignity stripped as surely as his skin. The emotional toll was as brutal as the physical. Napoleon, whose iron will had bent nations, was reduced to a state of utter vulnerability. His servants, like Ali, who had seen him command armies in Egypt, now held him down during treatments, their faces etched with anguish. The room, sealed against the island's damp air, became a claustrophobic hell, the flickering candlelight illuminating a scene of torture masquerading as medicine. The cultural context of 19th-century medicine amplified the tragedy. Doctors, as described in Thomas Watson's Principles and Practice of Physic, clung to aggressive interventions, believing inaction was failure. Yet these treatments were not just ineffective, they were sadistic, turning Napoleon's body into a canvas of pain. His swollen belly, stretched taut by fluid from the cancer, throbbed under the pressure of each blistering plaster, while his withered limbs trembled from mercury's toxic grip. The servants' accounts, preserved in the Mémorial de Sainte Helene, reveal their growing despair. Montholon wrote of a man who conquered Europe, now conquered by his own physicians. The comparison to other historical figures underscores the brutality. The French revolutionary Mirabeau, dying in 1791, was similarly subjected to purges and blistering, his death hastened by heroic medicine, as noted in contemporary journals. But Napoleon's case was uniquely horrifying, given his stature. The emperor who had crowned himself in Notre Dame was now a prisoner of his doctor's ignorance, each treatment a betrayal of the body that had carried him through 60 battles. The psychological impact was profound. Modern trauma studies suggest that such invasive procedures, coupled with loss of control, could deepen a patient's sense of helplessness. For Napoleon, this was a final indignity. His mind, still flickering with visions of past glories, was trapped in a body subjected to relentless violation. His attempts to assert control, like dictating his will, were overshadowed by moments of weakness, as when he begged for sugar water, his voice barely a whisper. The servants, torn between loyalty and horror, struggled to maintain the illusion of his imperial dignity, draping blankets over his burned and emaciated frame. As April gave way to May, the treatments grew more desperate, each dose of mercury and each burning plaster pushing Napoleon closer to the edge. The tumor, unchecked, continued its work, necrotizing tissue and filling the room with the stench of death. The doctors, blind to their own harm, pressed on, their interventions a grim prelude to the final catastrophic collapse that awaited. Napoleon, once the master of strategy, was now at the mercy of men who wielded medicine like a weapon, each treatment a step toward a death more agonizing than any battlefield could offer. The first days of May 1821 on St. Helena were a descent into a living nightmare. The air in Longwood House, thick with the stench of decay and despair. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the scourge of Europe, was now a prisoner of his own disintegrating body, the tumor in his stomach carving a path of destruction no army could match. By May 1st, his condition had spiraled into a grotesque tableau of suffering, each moment more horrific than the last. The carcinoma, now a leathery mass consuming his stomach, had perforated the organ's wall, creating a hole large enough to slip a finger through. Only a miraculous adhesion of scar tissue to his liver kept his abdominal cavity from flooding with its own contents, a fragile barrier between life and instant death. His valet, Louis-Joseph Marchand, recorded the scene with a trembling hand. The emperor's suffering was beyond what any man should endure. Napoleon's vomiting had become a violent ritual, each convulsion expelling not just blood, but chunks of his own stomach lining, dark and ragged, as if his body were tearing itself apart. The whites of his eyes, once piercing and gray, were now streaked red from burst blood vessels, a haunting contrast to his jaundiced skin. The smell in the room, a sickly blend of rotting tissue and burned sulfur, was so overpowering that even seasoned servants like Ali gagged, their loyalty tested by the apocalyptic decay surrounding their master. On May 1st, Napoleon demanded to walk, his imperial will flickering through the haze of pain. "I am emperor," he gasped, as if the title could command his failing body. 2 servants supported him, but on the 4th step, his legs buckled, his swollen belly convulsing so violently it seemed his end had come. Ali dove forward, catching the skeletal frame of the man who had once reviewed armies in Egypt's searing heat. They carried him back to bed, but Napoleon fought to rise again, muttering, "My army, where is my army?" 4 men held him down, their hands gentle but firm, as he thrashed against enemies only he could see. The Memorial de Sainte-Helene captures this moment. His spirit battled on, even as his flesh surrendered. The doctors, led by Dr. Archibald Arnott, pressed on with their brutal regimen. On May 3rd, they administered 20 grains of calomel, double the previous dose of mercury chloride, followed by an enema so violent that Napoleon, who had faced cannon fire without flinching, screamed in humiliation. The procedure forced out more black, tar-like stools mixed with fragments of his stomach, each expulsion a testament to the tumor's destruction. The Lancet of the era describes such purges as necessary to clear morbid matter, but modern medicine recognizes mercury poisoning as a catalyst for organ failure, likely exacerbating Napoleon's collapse. His screams echoed through Longwood's damp corridors, a sound not of pain alone, but of a man stripped of all dignity, his body violated by treatments as merciless as the cancer itself. By May 4th, Napoleon's body was in a death spiral, his breathing reduced to Shane Stokes' respiration, rapid gasps followed by eerie pauses, as if his brain had forgotten how to sustain life. Between convulsions, he tried to speak, blood frothing at his lips, words like France, mon fils, and l'armée bubbling through the gore. His servants, including Count Montfolon and Bertrand, stood vigil, each hearing what they longed to believe. Montfolon recorded France, Army, Josephine. Bertrand noted Tête d'armée. These fragmented words, preserved in their accounts, were less a final statement than a reflection of Napoleon's fractured mind, clinging to the pillars of his life, country, son, soldiers, even as his body liquefied. The room had become a grotesque parody of an imperial court. 16 people crowded around his bed, not to receive orders, but to witness a slow, torturous end. The servants' perspectives, often overlooked, reveal the emotional weight of these final days. Marchand, who had served Napoleon since 1814, wrote of a grief that tore the soul, watching the man who inspired thousands, reduced to animal-like groans. Ali, the Mamluk who had followed him from Egypt, stood silent, his eyes wet as he cleaned blood and tissue from the emperor's lips. The cultural context of the time, where death was a public affair for great men, made this vigil a ritual of loyalty, yet it was steeped in horror. Other historical figures, like the Russian Tsar Paul I, whose assassination in 1801 was followed by a grim public display of his body, faced similar post-mortem scrutiny. But Napoleon's decline was a spectacle of suffering while he still lived. The emotional toll on those around him was profound. Modern trauma studies suggest that witnessing such agony can leave lasting scars. And the servants' accounts reflect a mix of devotion and despair. The room, sealed against the island's damp air, was a suffocating chamber of flickering candles and acrid fumes, the tumor stench mingling with the mustard plasters applied in a final, futile attempt to rouse him. Napoleon's eyes, fixed on some distant point, no longer saw the world he had conquered, but a past he could not reclaim. As dawn broke on May 5th, his body pushed beyond every limit. The man who had defied empires was locked in a battle he could not win. Each gasp a step closer to the silence that awaited. The dawn of May 5th, 1821, broke over St. Helena with a cruel indifference. The island's jagged cliffs and crashing waves, a stark backdrop to the final hours of Napoleon Bonaparte. Inside Longwood House, the air was a miasma of decay, mustard and despair. The room a tomb for a man still clinging to life. The emperor, whose name once shook thrones, was now a husk, his body ravaged by a tumor that had perforated his stomach, his breathing reduced to gasping. Irregular rasps. Shane Stokes, a harbinger of the end. His throat had swollen shut, muffling the voice that had commanded armies, leaving only guttural, animal-like groans that chilled his servants. 16 loyal followers crowded around his bed, their faces etched with grief and horror, bearing witness to a death that was as much a spectacle of suffering as his life had been of glory. Louis-Joseph Marchand, his valet, wrote in his memoirs, "The emperor's final moments were a battle no general could win." At 5:49 p.m., after 17 hours of unrelenting agony, Napoleon's body gave out. No grand gesture, no final words, just a silence that fell like a guillotine. The autopsy the next day, conducted in Longwood's billiard room, revealed a horror that sent seasoned doctors reeling. When they sliced open his abdomen, the stench of rotting cancer, sweet, unforgettable, forced several to step outside. The tumor had consumed his stomach, turning it hard as leather. With a perforation near the pylorus so large, Dr. Francesco Antomarchi demonstrated it by pushing his finger through. White nodules, metastases like malignant pearls, studded his intestines, proof that the cancer had been spreading for years, a silent assassin during his exile. The Memorial de Saint Helene records the grim scene. His stomach was a ruin, a battlefield of disease. Unofficially, Antomarchi snipped rib fragments and, shockingly, Napoleon's penis, later smuggled away and described by a 20th-century observer as a leather shoelace, now part of an American urologist's collection. His heart and stomach were placed in silver vessels, his body dressed in his green uniform, bicorn hat at his feet, a final nod to the emperor he had been. But the greatest shock came 19 years later, in 1840, when his tomb was opened to return his body to France. The Times reported an impossible sight: Napoleon, perfectly preserved, his skin marble white, his features recognizable, his uniform intact. After nearly 2 decades in the ground, he looked as if buried yesterday. Theories swirled: arsenic in his system acting as a preservative, secret embalming, or some inexplicable quirk of nature. The Annales de France noted, even in death, he defied decay, as if his will refused to fade. This preservation was a final mystery in a life full of them, a haunting echo of the man who seemed larger than mortality itself. The horror of Napoleon's death was not just the cancer or the mercury poisoning that corroded his organs, nor the blistering plasters that burned his skin. It was the utter destruction of the man he had been. The tactical genius who outmaneuvered Europe at Austerlitz was reduced to delirium, screaming for invisible armies. The iron will that reclaimed France from Elba crumbled into childish pleas for sugar water. His body, which had endured Russian winters and point-blank gunfire, became a grotesque shell, rotting while he still breathed. His last coherent thoughts, fragmented in blood-frothed gasps, France, mon fils, l'armée, were of country, son, and soldiers. A soldier's heart beating beneath the emperor's crown. The cultural context of the early 19th century amplified the tragedy. Death for great men was a public affair, as seen in the elaborate funerals of figures like Nelson. But Napoleon's was a private horror, witnessed only by his loyalists and indifferent British captors. Governor Hudson Lowe's reports, cold and bureaucratic, noted only the prisoner's demise, ignoring the human cost. The medical practices, rooted in humoral theories as outlined in Thomas Watson's Principles and Practice of Physic, were barbaric by today's standards, yet standard for the time. Other leaders, like Louis XVIII, endured similar aggressive treatments, but Napoleon's stature made his suffering a singular tragedy, a fall from godlike power to mortal frailty. His legacy, however, is a paradox. Tourists today stand in awe before his red sarcophagus in Les Invalides, seeing glory carved in stone. They read of Marengo, Austerlitz, and Waterloo, but not of the man who vomited his own stomach lining, whose final days were a crucible of pain and humiliation. The memorial reflects this duality. He was the greatest of men, yet died the least of them. His death resonates in a modern world where cancer remains a scourge. WHO data from 2025 estimates 20 million new cases annually. Yet, Napoleon's end was uniquely brutal, a reminder that even conquerors are mortal. The emperor who reshaped Europe could not conquer the tumor in his gut, and his final transformation from titan to corpse was a lesson in vulnerability. His story demands we look beyond the glory, to the man who died trembling, not from fear, but from a body destroying itself. In the end, Napoleon's death was a truth all conquerors face. Death cares not for glory, and in its grip, we all die alone. So what do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below so we can chat about it together. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to follow my channel to catch the latest videos.